Welcome to our final unit in the Science and Ethics module, where we're going to look at incorporating ethical issues in the classroom. So we've learned a bit about ethics now. We've looked at contemporary issues, we've looked at ethics in scientific research and why ethics and understanding of ethics in science is important. So what is your role in the classroom when introducing the teaching of ethics in science? So this is a really important point because it's great to have a working knowledge about an issue, but then as a teacher, we need to think about what our role is in the education process with our students. So obviously, we as teachers have an influence over students. Students become accustomed to being told what the answers are. And this becomes more of an issue as they go through their upper primary years and into lower secondary, in that there's an increased reliance on textbooks and resources. And because of the nature of the concepts being introduced, teachers tend to do a lot more teacher-centred delivery of content. So to resist this temptation, teachers are encouraged to need to encourage students to think for themselves and to respect one another as mutual inquirers in the process. So in this viewpoint, teachers are looked at as facilitators, and we want to try and keep that role, particularly as students advance through the grades. We don't want to resort to that transmissive teacher-centered approach. So the mark of success is students engaging in thoughtful, informed discussion that shows respect for both the subject at hand and the student's own reflections. And so clearly with ethical issues, they do touch on sort of moral, religious, emotive issues. So we have to be careful as teachers to respect students' viewpoints. So here's some ground rules. If we're going to engage students in ethical discussions, we need to be sure that the students are aware of these rules. So they need to realise they'll be expected to support their views with good reasons, which requires them to be as well informed about relevant factual information, social policies, laws, and possible ethical stances as they can. We don't want to engage students in discussions where they have no underlying understanding of some of the concepts behind them, or else it just ends up being a he said, she said, back and forth, argument. So we need to make sure that as teachers, we provide them with some evidence to start with about, so say for example, the GMOs we were talking about, to give them some understanding of what a GMO is, why it's important, why it's being cultivated, etc. The second one is, although some disagreements among students are to be expected, an atmosphere of put-downs, impatient rejection of the ideas of others, and disrespectful behaviour in general needs to be discouraged. So teachers need to model this for their students and to model what's appropriate as a response and what's not appropriate. Teachers need to encourage an atmosphere of reasonableness, an atmosphere in which students are willing to listen to and reason with one another. And it's really important to point out that as students get towards the end of their primary schooling and they're entering into that period of adolescence, they become less likely to engage in discussions. So you may find if you teach into the junior secondary years, you'll see a shift. Whereas in childhood, students want to be the ones to offer ideas. In early adolescence, they do tend to want to pull back. They don't want to look silly in front of their friends. There's a lot more self-consciousness. So it's actually sometimes more difficult to engage them in discussions as we enter into those years. So here's some techniques and strategies for incorporating ethics within science lessons, whether that be within the upper primary or the lower secondary. We can use a number of different teaching pedagogies. We can use case studies, which we're going to look at today, where we give them a scenario or a set of scenarios or stories that are designed to illustrate specific ethical issues associated with science. We get them to read the scenario. They can do it individually or within a group, and they're asked to respond to questions designed to probe their ethics and values contents. So I have put a set of case studies within this unit on Learning at Griffith. So when you've clicked on to access this mini lecture, you'll see there's a folder there with 5 case studies. And so if you click on that, there's a bunch of these in there that are designed to illustrate particular ethical issues. Another one is the use of structured controversy. So in this pedagogy, students are divided into groups of 2 pairs, And in each group, the pairs are given one of two essays describing opposing views of a controversial issue related to science. So we give one with, a great example is one we're going to do later in this course where we look at global warming in the next module actually, and it's actually one of your portfolio pieces. We give one pair an article which stresses that global warming is not really happening, that it's natural, and the other pair we give a similar kind of media article, but it's actually saying humans have caused global warming and it's terrible. So two opposing views, and within any issue in science there are always two views as a minimum. So the students read and discuss the issue amongst themselves, and then the pairs engage in a debate in which they focus on the ethics and value differences that underlie the conflicting positions. So then the pairs exchange their essays, and they do it this time, they debate again, but in this instance then they have to try and support the opposite position, and then the teacher can rotate amongst the groups. So it's a really effective way of getting students to challenge their beliefs, because most people have what we call a confirmation bias. So this is a psychological notion where we'll have a view on something, and when we read a media report or we watch a story, what we're looking for is confirming evidence of our position. So we'll tend to pay attention to the evidence which supports us, and we'll tend to ignore the evidence that doesn't support our position. So again, it's a psychological notion that the general public does use all the time. So they'll watch a media report, and you can have two people watch the same report and have very different viewpoints about it, because they will tend to look for evidence that supports their position and ignore the rest. So this is a great way of actually engaging students in considering the opposite side. So if you click on this link, it will take you to a set of scenarios that can be used for structured controversy in the classroom. So let's have a quick look. So here's the link to the structured controversy. There's 5 examples shown here. Here's one about science and religion, the teaching of evolutionary theory. So you can click on there and access some reports there. One on climate change, and you can see this is a US website, protection of wolves. So, it's kind of set in the US context. Animal rights and welfare, and vaccinations. So this is a really interesting site to access some resources that you can use in the classroom. Other techniques you can use are panel discussion. So this is where students are given a description of a scientific dispute facing a community, as well as an outline of the positions likely to be taken by key parties to the dispute, government officials and citizen groups. Students are then selected to represent the various parties, and they engage in a panel discussion with the remainder of the class directing questions at the panelists. So each of those panelists, the students that take on those roles, they act in the role. So there could be a mayor of a particular city, there could be a scientist, there could be a politician. So they actually are working within that role to tend to appreciate the different ethical positions that different members of a community may engage in. The other one you can do is maintaining a journal, so an ethics and values journal. So students are instructed to make weekly entries in a journal concerning the ethics and values issues described in science articles appearing in newspapers or magazines. So that's quite an effective way of highlighting within those media stories what the potential ethical issues are, and you can collect those and comment on them. The other one's a moot court. So students are given details of a case involving an individual who's being accused of some kind of scientific misconduct, and different students are assigned to play the roles of the defendant, the judge, the witnesses, etc. So it's similar to the panel discussion, but it's more a legal sort of case. Okay, so let's examine a case study. Now this one you may never have heard of, the Love Canal. Again, it's a US-based one, but it's really interesting. I think it's amazing, and there is a link in your reading number 2, I think, that looks at this case study in a text-based format. But I think this video is probably more powerful, and I want you to have a think about the different ethical issues that are raised in this particular case in the US, and then we're going to examine A not so dissimilar case that has occurred in our own backyard here in our Logan community. So let's start with this one.
In 1892, William T. Love proposed connecting the upper and lower Niagara rivers by digging a 6-mile canal to provide cheap hydroelectric power to the area. This region, located in New York State, became known as Love Canal. However, after only a mile of the trench was dug, the project was abandoned due to a lack of funding. The canal then became a landfill for chemical waste used by Hooker Chemical Corporation, the City of Niagara Falls, and the U.S. Army. Approximately 22,000 tons of at least 200 different chemicals were dumped by Hooker Chemical Company from 1942 to 1953. Then, in 1953, they sealed the landfill with a clay cap to contain the chemical waste and sold the land to the Niagara Falls Board of Education for $1. Despite Hooker's warnings of the potentially toxic nature of the property, the city proceeded to build an elementary school on the newly acquired land. In addition to the elementary school, hundreds of homes were built on the periphery of the former landfill site. This development of the land caused cracks to form in the clay barrier beneath. Soon after, residents began to complain of strange chemical odors, minor explosions, and black sludge seeping into their yards and basements. Children playing outside would return home with minor chemical burns on their feet and legs. These complaints began to surface in the early 1950s, but were not investigated until the late 1970s. Subsequent environmental sampling in basements next to the waste site detected over 200 different compounds. Of those, at least 12 are known to cause cancer. Additionally, high levels of dioxin, a chemical that the New York State Health Commissioner described as the most toxic substance ever synthesized by man, were found in the water. Many of these chemicals eventually migrated to nearby creeks, bioaccumulating in the tissues of plants and animals in the larger Niagara Falls area. Thus, the water contamination had negative repercussions on the entire ecosystem. With test results pouring in regarding the toxicity of the chemicals surrounding them, the residents of Love Canal became increasingly distressed. Lois Gibbs, the mother of a child at the local elementary school, began organizing the community and formed the Love Canal Homeowners Association in 1978 without any prior experience in activism. Her organization faced tremendous difficulty in getting the government to acknowledge that there was a problem, much less respond to it. Eventually, a very limited evacuation ensued, and a cleanup of the canal site began. The government only paid for the evacuation of pregnant women and children under the age of 2. Thousands of outraged residents still remained in danger. Then, in 1979, the EPA announced the result of blood tests that showed chromosome damage in over 30% of the residents of Love Canal, as opposed to only 1% in a typical population. Additionally, many children had birth defects. In 1 year, out of 22 pregnancies, only 4 babies were born normally. For example, one child was born with a cleft palate, deformed ears, impaired learning ability, deafness, and an extra row of teeth. By 1980, the residents had become so desperate that they took 2 federal officials hostage and demanded that the president take action. Amid a media frenzy and an upcoming presidential election, President Carter took note and a federal state of emergency was finally declared. A few months later, Congress authorized funding for the permanent relocation of all Love Canal residents. Finally, after years of collective effort and activism, the Love Canal residents seemed to be saved. Years after the fact, we can now see how the Love Canal disaster led to several positive developments in the United States. To help ensure that nothing like this happens again, many national legislative changes were enacted to help protect people and the environment. Love Canal also led to the creation of Superfund, a governmental program established to help clean up hazardous waste sites and hold companies accountable for their own environmental irresponsibility. More than just structural changes, the Love Canal disaster also significantly shaped how Americans view hazardous waste and environmental protection as a whole. It spawned a grassroots movement that gave Americans a voice on environmental issues and championed the powers of democracy.
Well, I hope you enjoyed watching that clip. It's quite hard to believe that things like that can occur, and the cover-ups that happen by various sections of the community, particularly ones that have political and economic implications. So I wanted to link this one in to a not dissimilar occurrence that happened in the Logan area, and actually it occurred in the area where I actually spent many years from about year 6 through to year 12. So I lived in Kingston in this Logan area, and I actually lived in this actual site where the next local context disaster is going to be played out, which I'm going to show you now. I don't know if you may know about it, but it pretty much has been not particularly well publicised, and it was the Kingston toxic waste disaster. So it's a very similar story to the Love Canal disaster. So the Kingston toxic waste story began in 1931 when cyanide and other toxins such as acid waste used in the Mount Taylor gold refining process were disposed of around the mine site. So basically this mine site was, in the Queens Road area. So if anyone knows the area well, used to have the old Jack the Slasher and the Red Rooster, which I think is still there, area. And when the mine closed in 1954, the Albert Shire Council started to allow used recycled oil processing waste to be dumped into a sludge pit on the site. And this practice continued until 1967. So what basically happened was a whole bunch of toxic waste was dumped into this site. And so from 1968 to 1973, this open cut pit was used as a domestic and industrial waste tip. So around about 1968, the council required the pit to be filled because they wanted to subdivide the land for residential use. So what they did is the workers simply moved the displaced sludge and redumped it into the open cut pit. And then it was all covered up because they wanted to rezone it for housing. So in 1982, after the Logan Council took over the area, it discovered high levels of acid in the soil. So in September 1986, residents in the Diamond Street area of Kingston started to notice black sludge beginning to ooze from the ground and started to complain of health problems to the Logan Council. So it's interesting in this period, it was the period I was actually in high school, and I do remember my best friend had stated, because she lived in that Diamond Street area, that they actually, and I actually saw it myself, they actually had noticed this black, thick sort of sludge starting to come up through the ground into their garden. And if you touched it, it actually burnt you. So by April 1987, the council was warning people to avoid the sludge. Surrounding soils and groundwater were also found to be contaminated. So over these years, an activist group called RATS, so Residents Against Toxic Substances, formed, and they became very frustrated with the lack of action by the council. And health reports did show there was an increased incidence of leukemia and other diseases in the Kingston area. So, the public started to demand action. And clearly, if you know the Logan Corridor, residents that live in Kingston, which has a high proportion of government housing, they couldn't afford any sort of legal action. So they went to the media and began a self-funded civil action. So it took 4 years of fighting the council and local governments for the residents of Kingston to be vindicated. When the Queensland government ordered a review of all the scientific and medical evidence, they offered full health tests for residents and announced that the site would be rehabilitated and families provided with compensation to move out of the area. So eventually the state government resumed 46 properties and rehabilitated the area, completing the project in 1991, and it's now known as Kingston Park. So anyone that does know the area, that's the history of it. It's still an area that can be used, even though basically the council have said that it's safe. But, the underlying cause is still there. The final medical report found no evidence of a major toxic hazard in Kingston, but recognised that the stress on a number of residents had happened because of the uncertainty. So the Kingston residents could not substantiate that the dumped toxic chemicals had caused leukemia or any other disease because the testing just was not conducted. So although the Mount Taylor site was capped, sealed and vented in 1991, none of the toxic waste has been removed. So basically what they have done is they've provided a barrier between the residents and the toxic waste, but the toxic waste is still there. So some former residents believe there's still a major toxic hazard that lies buried and waiting under the ground at Kingston. So what do you think? I mean, many of our students that have taken this course live in the Logan area. So, you know, this is our own Love Canal happening right here in our own backyard. So, and as someone who had lived through it in the 80s and actually seen the evidence of it and seen the lack of action, this really brings through some really key ethical considerations. Okay, so to sum up, here's some important considerations when incorporating ethical issues. And again, what I've just talked about, again, is personal to me because I actually lived through that particular incident. So I probably have a little bias in my view in that I've had a lot of personal connections with it. But knowing and understanding that the personal lives and experiences of our students may be closer to some of these issues than we realise is important as a teacher. So here's some examples. And the first one, again, I can relate to is consider how students who live in Kingston and the surrounding areas would react to the previous story. So some might feel like me and just think, well, this is just not good enough and we should have done more. Others might feel embarrassment that they live in an area that could have that sort of problem. So people react differently, and particularly children and adolescents. They can sometimes react differently to what you may think. Consider how the discussion of a debilitating hereditary condition may affect a student who has a family member or close friend who suffers from that condition. So when you're discussing different diseases like leukemia and Parkinson's disease, think about people that may be personally affected by that. Consider how children of scientists may be disturbed by suggestions that the scientists aren't all scrupulously honest. That's another important one to think about. Conversely, think about people who have religious family members. Again, might feel about different issues, particularly the one we were talking about with stem cells and using fetal tissue. And that one relates a little bit to the last one. Consider how discussing the ethics of various techniques used to enhance reproductive techniques may distress a student who has learnt that he or she is some form of test tube baby. So students who have been conceived by IVF means, again, where there's been a technology involved, they could feel personally affronted. So all of these are important things to think about when we're talking about ethical issues. So what I'd like you to do is in that case studies folder, there's 5 case studies in there on the Learning at Griffith site. And the cases involve issues from a variety of science disciplines. So I want you to have a read through or skim through all 5 and maybe pick one and think about the ethical issues highlighted in the particular case. And I'd really like for you to share some of your views about your case on the discussion board, whether that be a sentence or it could be a paragraph, or you might want to tell me lots and lots. That's fine, but I'd be really interested in your views. So we've finished our 3rd module now. Importantly though, don't go and do the quiz because the quiz for module 3 and module 4 is combined. So you need to wait now on that 3rd quiz and do your module 4 and then come back and do the quiz because the content is sourced from 3 and 4 for that particular one. All right, so let's get to the portfolio item, number 3. So remember I gave you that link to the Australian curriculum in the earlier unit. So what you need to do is you need to identify a content descriptor / elaboration which addresses an ethical component or consideration. Now we've looked at stem cells in this module, so I want you to address a different one than stem cells, but I want you to be able to identify in the curriculum where we consider ethical issues. So you have to have a little skim through in the years 7 to 10 and see where there's one that addresses something to do with ethics. Now I want you to provide a summary of the main content of your ethical issue. so around about 1 A4 page, just in age-appropriate language. I want you then to suggest a classroom activity you could implement with your students to illustrate this issue and describe the activity in a half to 1 page. So we've talked about some pedagogies you could use, like the role play, structured controversy, panel discussion, moot court. Any of those you could choose, or something else. Make sure you write down the content descriptor and elaboration that you're using from the Australian curriculum. And make sure your summary is written in language that would enable a junior secondary science teacher, so year 7 to 10, to understand and implement the information effectively. So we're going to have a look at a couple of examples. So here's one. This one's looking at organ transplants and ethics. It's found a content descriptor from the Australian curriculum. So it gives me, it's nice. It's got, lots of nice little illustrations, user-friendly language. So what's an organ transplant? What are the ethics behind it? So this is quite good. What's the classroom activity that you could do to incorporate this in the classroom? So this one's using a debate and giving me some information about what they would debate about. That's really important. And then some useful websites and a little description of the website. So that one's really a nice, effective summary, 2 pages in total. Here's another one. So this one's looking at reproductive technologies. So any of the technologies that are used to assist people to become pregnant. Again, it's told me what the Australian content descriptor and elaboration, which one it's addressing. It's putting forward the issue in the form of a question, which you can do. A brief summary of the content of the ethical issue. Now, what you might notice here, though, is there's no summary of the science behind the issue. So remember in the last one, they talked about what's an organ transplant and gave some background. This one doesn't do that. It just goes straight into what the ethics is behind the issue. And again, that's quite short. And then it goes into the classroom activities. So it actually gives 2, a case study, some questions, and another activity where there's a lesson plan as well, but no references, no websites, no descriptions, and not a lot of information about the activity. So that one's not as good. On first glance, it looks good, but not particularly addressing the criteria. And most importantly, let's have a look at our task sheet and criteria for this item. So we're up to portfolio item 3. It's marked out a 7.5 and it addresses criteria 1, 2 and 3. So let's have a look. So here's criteria 1, portfolio item 1. So I want a highly accurate, detailed summary of the ethical component or consideration. So that's the one where you tell me about what the actual issue is and the science behind it. I want a highly effective, clearly outlined teaching activity chosen, which accurately illustrates the concept in a novel fashion. So make sure that you clearly outline what the activity is, don't just list it. And then I want you to use material from at least 5 websites that are reputable, meaning that they're not just got a particular slant and it's someone trying to drive a particular agenda that might be motivated by economic sort of constraints or political ones particularly. So make sure that you interpret that evidence in an innovative way. Explicit referencing, meaning at the end of the item, please include the URL, the title, and just a sentence or 2 about what that website's about. Okay, so that should give you a little bit of information about what I want you to do for that module item. And in the next module, we're going to be looking at science and decision making. So once you finish that one, you can do the quiz for module 3 and 4. And we're going to look in the next one at using debates and argumentation in science education.